Hi guys, so this is my Sculpting Eyes demo. This is just sculpting eyes out of clay. I'll do a demo on sculpting glass eyes later. First, I'm starting out with a bit of clay and I'm taking off a piece to make an eyeball with, and then I'm pinching out a form to make an eye socket. This is how I normally build. I usually build hollow, so the walls of my sculpture are only like 1/4 of an inch thick. I'll show another way on how to build more like a solid form later. So this is my eye socket, nice and deep. Keep making everything smooth. I kind of have a little bit of a brow form in there as well, just for reference. And I'm going to take a little knife and I'm going to slice in the center of that eye socket. Now I'm rolling my little eyeball. A human eyeball is about the same size as a golf ball. This is going to be a little bit smaller than that. And from the back side, I'm pushing that slit open, and this is going to form the eyelids. And then I'm taking the eyeball, putting it behind it, and then I'm just pushing that eyeball through and then forming the eyelids around that ball shape. And now you have an eyeball with eyelids. And I take some time to kind of form around that eyeball, making a little iris and making sure everything's nice and smooth and that slit isn't cracking open at the in and outer corners of the eye. And now I'm just taking this to kind of smooth everything down, clean everything up a little bit. And that's like the most basic way that you can make an eyeball. So on the left side is the inner corner and the right side is the outer corner. I also want to make sure that I'm building up that area above and the area below to create the cheekbone and the brow bone. Super simple, easy peasy. With this technique, it's really easy to create the illusion of eyelashes by just pinching that very edge of the eyelid out. That's where the nose is, just to kind of reference that. So now I'm going to show you different ways to make the eyeball itself. So this was one way, or the way that I showed was the first way. This is another way. I'm just taking a little pointy tool, stabbing it in, and there you have an iris and a pupil. Very, very simple. Another way is to take a little rounded tool rather than a pointy tool. And it does the same effect, but it just looks a little bit smoother. And it's going to be more perfectly round, as long as you're not like squishing the eye like I just did. Another way is to flatten like using a flat tool. You can also take it and pat your eyeball against a flat surface, and it creates a nice flat area for you to draw the iris. And I'm just taking the edge of this tool to create the lines of the iris in a nice radial pattern. And then I'm taking this pointier tool, poking it in. Now I have an iris and a pupil. You want to make sure that the iris doesn't get too big or it's going to look very cartoonish. So another way is to take this is kind of a cupped silicone shape, or it's a silicone brush. It's a very stiff kind of rubber silicone type of surface, and it has this cup form. And I'm just using the edge of it to create this rounded dome within the eyeball, taking a little pointy tool, poking it in, and now I have an iris and a pupil once again. Another way, this is how I originally started making eyes or irises. I would poke a hole in the center and then I would poke a series of holes equidistant from that center point. And that would create the outer edge of the iris. And then I would go through and just create these lines either by impressing or by carving or by painting from that ring. And then you can go in and either carve out or paint on or poke in like I did to make the pupil. Another way is to create that outer ring. And you can do that by using a stamp or by drawing it like I did here. And now I'm going to carve away. I'm going to use this knife just to cut that flat surface off. So let's say you're using a harder material like wood. This is a way that you can just carve out all of the forms. So just creating a flat plane for the iris and then carving out the pupil. A lot of traditional sculptors will then take like a little nugget of that same material, a tiny little cylinder, and they'll put it back inside of the pupil, and this creates the illusion of that glare that's on like a glossy eyeball. Um, and it makes the figure look like they have a little bit more life in them, like there's that illusion of that gloss that's not actually there. You can carve around that, or you can make it separately and then add it into the hole of the pupil later on. Let's say you want to make two eyeballs that are identical. You can roll a nice, even ball of clay and then just cut it perfectly in half and then re-roll them as necessary. A lot of times I'll kind of roll like a flattened, like a really fat pancake or like a flattened sphere just to save on thickness. And then I'll make sure to reform it so it's a nice hemisphere. So this is going to be more of a solid building kind of way. So I'm starting with the eyeball in the center, and I'm going to be building up an area for the eyebrow ridge, the zygomatic bone or the cheekbone, and then I'm also going to put in a coil, a nice thick coil, to show where the nose is going to be. And then what I'm doing is I'm rolling out these fatter coils. I'm just flattening the bottom so that I'm making the eyeball ahead of time. So you can always make the pupil first and then the iris. I decided to just do that ahead of time so I didn't have to go back in and try and change that. So now I'm rolling some coils and I'm going to flatten them, and these are going to be what forms the eyelids. So you want to make at least one edge as flat as an eyelid is thick, and you're just going to lay that over top of the eye and all of the forms around it to create that skin. I always do the bottom lid first because if you look closely at an eyeball, a lot of times it's like the top eyelid is kind of gracefully going over top of the lower lid. So I'm always in the habit of building the bottom lid first and then building the upper lid above that and slightly overlapping it. So I'm just pinching this down to about the thickness that an eyelid naturally is. Making sure everything's nice and formed around, and then laying that upper eyelid over top. And I don't press it down until I'm happy with how it's curving around the eyeball itself. And then I go through with some tools or with my fingers to kind of smooth that attachment point together, making sure not to obliterate that inner corner or that outer corner. And once you have the eyelids over the eyeball itself, you can go in and kind of refine the way that it's hugging the eyeball in certain areas, um, and doing some more like detail-oriented kind of work. This is an extra blob of clay. This is what it is forming the lacrimal gland and the orbital bone on the upper outside of the eye. without having this extra form, your eyes are going to look very surprised and a little like too open. So this just adds a little bit of extra naturalism to it. And then I'm adding a little bit more clay to create the eyebrow ridge. And making sure to smooth that in as appropriate. And then also adding a little extra coil. This is what I'm going to use to create an eyebrow. There are so many different ways to make eyebrows. One is to add a really thin coil like I'm doing here, and then creating texture with that, just using a little tool. If your clay is wet enough, you can use a paintbrush, like a nice natural hair bristle brush. If your coil is too thick, you'll have huge eyebrows. And if your coil is too thin, it'll probably actually look super natural. So I'm going to take some of that eyebrow off. It's a little bit too bushy. And then I'm going to use that clay to build up above the eyebrow into the forehead. Like so. Now let's say you don't like that texture of the eyebrow hairs, it's just a little bit too much. You can always smooth that out and create the illusion of an eyebrow with a really smooth ridge. This is often, you'll see this done in like marble sculptures or marble busts. There's not actually eyebrow hairs a lot of the times. It's just this like ridge that gives the illusion that there's an eyebrow there, the form of an eyebrow there. So let's look at these two different ways of sculpting the eyes. Um, First off, obviously, the one that you're building solidly is going to give you an easier time at smoothing everything out because you have a lot of clay or an armature that's backing it. And you can build very additively. What's also nice about it is you can push things around and it's not going to distort everything. It's only going to alter what you're intending to change. So now I'm going to take this eyeball out and I'm going to show you what the different eyeballs look like within this form. So this is that more traditional sculpted eyeball. This is an iris that's very structural. And you can see what each of these eyes is going to look like, squinting or widening the eye. What the eye looks like moving around. If the iris is just a little bit too big, how weird that looks. Or if the iris is a little small, does that change the expression? Squinting, widening the eye. You can also take a little rounded tool like this or the eyeball that you're using to sculpt, and you can push the eyelid open depending on which direction that the eye is gazing in. So the way that the eyeball is formed is the cornea or that clear part right above your iris is actually built up further. It has more of a bubble on it. And so if your eye is going to change direction, your eyelid also has to form around that. So you want to make sure that whatever wherever your iris is or wherever your eye direction is looking, you want to make sure that the eyelid is forming with that as well. You want to focus on the inner corner, the outer corner of the eyes, and making sure that you're building things up as needed, making sure that things are at the right angles. And if you're wanting to be specific about the way different eyes look, everybody has a different form of eyeballs. Some people have very prominent eyelids. Some people have just like a little bit of that double eyelid. And some people don't have that double eyelid as readily or as easily identified. So whenever you're sculpting an eye, make sure you're really focusing on the form and being specific to, if you're sculpting an actual person or from a model, that you are really looking at the form of their eye and making adjustments so that you're sculpting what it is you're intending to sculpt. And that's going to make everything look a lot more real when you're sculpting with intention. So I'm just widening the iris because that iris is a little bit too small for the size of this eye. And just changing the shape just to show different ways that eyes can be formed. A double lid, no visible double lid, and how different forms around the eye will change the way that the eye will look. If you're sculpting with a water-based clay, it's very important that you smooth any sort of cracks or cuts because they will grow more throughout like the firing process if you're choosing to fire it. Just a quick little pointer on that. Some texture is fine, but if you're making any cuts, you want to make sure that those get compressed. And you with clay, you can carve away at it. You can impress into it to create lines. So have a variety of tools as you're working as well. Also think about the direction that the eye is. Is the eye pointing upward? Is the eye pointing downward? Um, and yeah, just be very conscious of how everything is formed and form accordingly.